All right. Well, hi, everybody. Coming to you from Alberta on eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains on this sunny, windy afternoon. Happy equinox. And I'm going to be talking about the chapters 36 to 46 of The Duke's Children. Quote, "It was now the middle of August. Everybody had left London, and Major Tifto had failed in a little attempt he had made to be taken down to a Scotch shooting." End quote. For the next 10 chapters, hold tight to your baggage because we will be transiting between 8 very diverse settings in rapid succession. Very diverse as to geographic location, landscape, architecture, and most importantly, people. Our first stop is at Egham, about 20 miles west of central London. Here, Major Tifto, quote, had a set of stables a little bigger than his house and a set of kennels a little bigger than his stables, end quote. After a hard day with the horses and the dogs, the Major is relaxing over gin and cigars with another pretender to military honors, his friend, Captain Green. Under the influence of the alcohol and tobacco, these two philosophers explore the concept of staying square. Quote, "Hitherto the Major had fought his battles with a certain adherence to squareness. If his angles had not all been perfect angles, still there had always been an attempt at geometrical accuracy." End quote. But the elusive Captain Green had suggested something about the young lord's bets, and Tifto owes money to Captain Green. Quote, "Why hadn't Silverbridge taken him down to Scotland for the grouse?" Close quote. Leaving Tifto and his rather grubby little establishment behind, we are transported 250 miles north to a beautiful old house built in the 15th century with, quote, oriel windows, twisted chimneys, long galleries, gable ends, and much more. Here we find the woman who our narrator back in chapter 10 refers to as my heroine, Lady Mabel Grex. Quote, "She was having what she thought to be the greatest luxury of the year, spending a quiet 2 weeks at the ancient county seat of her father, Earl Grex. Lady Mabel loved the place with a fond love." Unquote. We learned in previous chapters of her passionate love for Frank Tregear, which she has denied in order to marry a man with money. If she could marry Silverbridge, or his equivalent, she would have the resources to restore to glory the place she loves the most. It has been less than a year since Lady Mabel and Frank broke off what must have been a private engagement, agreeing that they were free to pursue more lucrative partnerships. They were each free. Now Frank intrudes on her 2 weeks of precious solitude. When she tells him he should not have come, he asks, why not? The question I would like him to answer is why? Why did he come? Lady Mabel accuses him of coming to flaunt his happiness, to wound her to the core by telling her he now loves Lady Mary more than all the world. Is that it? Is he taking revenge for her rejection of him? Is he telling the truth? How big a part does Lady Mary's money play in Frank's love? The scene now shifts another 250 miles north to the delightfully named Crummy Toddy, an estate west of Perthshire in Scotland. And, quote, "Crummy Toddy was but 12 miles from Killancodlem, Mrs. Montacute Jones's Highland seat." End quote. This is the first time Trollope readers have met the intrepid Reginald Dobbs, who rules his own personal game preserve with an iron hand. But the attractions provided by Mrs. Montacute Jones's very fine house for ladies to flirt in make it a challenge to keep the loyalty of his recruits. Dobbs's domain is Spartan, basic, and ugly. He treats these 5 young nobles to a kind of boot camp. Quote, this was man's work. He wanted all to work hard and do their part of the required slaughter. Over at Killancodlem, quote, there were carriages and saddle horses, and paths had been made hither and thither through the rocks and the hills for the sake of the scenery. Scenery. To hear Mr. Dobbs utter the single word was as good as a play. Mrs. Montacute Jones explains, Mr. Dobbs and I are sworn enemies. We both like Scotland, and unfortunately we have fallen into the same neighborhood. He looks upon me as the genius of sloth. I regard him as the incarnation of tyranny. He once said there should be no women in Scotland, just an old one here and there who would know how to cook grouse. I offered to go and cook his grouse. End quote. As I understand it, putting game theory to work for you requires a clear understanding of the desired outcome, and then you try to maximize the odds. Reginald Dobbs is very clear. He wants to, quote, bring up the grand total of killed to a figure which would render Dobbs and Crummy Toddy famous throughout the whole shooting world, close quote. Frank Tregear says, I came here to amuse myself. A very clear goal that Dobbs considers flat mutiny. Gerald, Popplecourt, and Nidderdale are okay with bagging as much game as they can in the given time, although not as dedicated as Dobbs. But the other players are not so clear. Silverbridge joined the shooting party because he heard Mabel Grex was to be at Killancodlem. End quote. He intended to marry Mabel Grex, the marriage having been assented to as being in all respects fit and proper by his father, and he could assure himself that he thoroughly loved her. Nevertheless, he liked making love to Isabel Boncassen. Close quote. Let's keep in mind that Silverbridge is 22 years old. Lady Mabel Grex is deeply conflicted. She still loves Frank Tregear, but thinks the only outcome she can live with is to marry Silverbridge and be a duchess someday. If that really is her goal, she metaphorically at least drops the ball when she declines to join the tennis match. Instead, quote, she sat almost the entire afternoon looking at the game from a distance. She told herself that they were making love to each other before her eyes. This wonderfully described lawn tennis game was considered so pivotal, the Oxford World Classics Complete Edition, which many of you are reading, used it as a cover illustration. The painting is an early work by the wonderful Irish painter, Sir John Lavery, appropriately titled The Rally. And the 2 young people in the painting give us a vivid visual image of Silverbridge and Isabel Boncassen. Quote, when youth and pleasure meet to chase the glowing hours with flying feet, close quote. Lady Mabel somewhat ominously repeats to herself these lines from Lord Byron's poem, The Eve of Waterloo, while she watches the odds against her lengthen. Lady Mabel is nowhere now. Quote, she had played her cards so badly that the game was now beyond her powers, close quote. But still she labors on, attempting to convince Silverbridge and herself that she, because of her rank and experience, would make a better wife than Isabel. The next day, she converses for over an hour with Isabel, after which Isabel goes directly to Silverbridge to refuse him. What do you think that conversation was about? It seems likely that Mabel used those arguments of rank and status to convince Isabel that she would be causing harm to Silverbridge by marrying him. In any case, the upshot is that Isabel insists Silverbridge stay away from her for 3 months, time for Lady Mabel to have another run at the prize. The scene now shifts some 1,300 miles southeast. Quote, one morning in September, Phineas and Marie were together at a hotel in Ischl, whither they had come from Vienna, when as they went through the hall into the courtyard to get into a carriage, they came in the very doorway upon the Duke of Omnium and his daughter, close quote. An awkward and unexpected encounter. They dined that evening with Mary and the Duke, who, after his long sojourn away from London, enthusiastically engages in conversation with Phineas about politics. Quote, later in the evening, the Duke found himself sitting with Mrs. Finn in the broad veranda over the hotel garden, close quote, and they converse about Mary for 5 pages. Their chance meeting in a European city where Marie is much at home and Plantagenet is the outsider makes it possible for Marie to explain some home truths to him and makes it possible for him to hear them. But he is haunted by the ghost of Glencora's love for Burgo Fitzgerald, and he is, quote, most unwilling to have the difference between Burgo and Frank Tregear pointed out to him, close quote. He has to believe that Glencora was better off with him than with Burgo. Therefore, he is determined that Mary is better off with someone other than Frank. But Frank, Marie tells him, is good and trustworthy and honest. And Lady Cantrip, back in chapter 34, observes, quote, no doubt that Lady Glencora had been turned from her evil destiny. But at the time, Lady Glencora had been younger than her daughter was now and possessed of very much less character, close quote. Lady Cantrip's opinion, Mary has more character than Glencora. She has her father's strength, or call it stubbornness, quote. I will never give it up, Mrs. Finn, never, never. It is no use taking me to China, close quote. Our scene shifts back to the games just winding up in Scotland. At Mabel's request, Silverbridge stops in at Killancodlem on his way back to London. Isabel Boncassen has left the field, and Mabel gives it her best shot. That ubiquitous diamond ring again enters the story. Silverbridge has it ready to hand in his pocket even now. Why? I don't get that one. When he had the ring sized and sent it to Mabel, he certainly intended it as a proposal of marriage. When Mabel wrote that, quote, she would keep it till she could give it to his wife, she had certainly intended that the ring should be her own, close quote. But now, when he offers it again and she says, quote, that your wife must have, he certainly would not tell her now that she might take it in that capacity, close quote. That sentence was restored in the new edition, and it emphasizes how much things have changed for Silverbridge. When he puts the ring back in his pocket, Mabel should know she has lost the race, but still she continues to plead her case by arguing that his marriage to Isabel would disgrace his family. Now we are off to the races, horse races, that is. We travel to Doncaster, about 170 miles north of London, for the running of the world's oldest classic, the pinnacle of achievement for flat racing in Britain, and the final challenge of what is now the Triple Crown in the UK, the St. Leger, established in 1776. Quote, the Leger this year was to be run on the 14th of September, and while Lord Silverbridge was amusing himself with the deer at Crummy Toddy and at Killancodlem with the more easily pursued young ladies, The indefatigable Major was hard at work in the stables, close quote. In what has to be a charming coincidence, the present Prime Minister of the UK also traveled to Doncaster on the 14th of September, but in 2024. From the Doncaster Free Press, quote, in an official comment provided shortly after the Prime Minister and Lady Starmer arrived at Doncaster, the Prime Minister said, there aren't many better days out than the races in the sunshine. So it's a pleasure to be back at Doncaster for the historic St. Leger this year. In our novel, Prime Minister is the name of the horse, owned jointly by Tifto and Silverbridge. In June, Prime Minister ran in the penultimate classic, the Epsom Derby, coming in a good second, and is favored to win the Leger at a longer distance. Why then does Major Tifto, as his friend Captain Green reminds him, have all his money on the other way already? He is betting against his own horse. Lord Silverbridge, our 22-year-old hero, overindulges the night before the race, and despite a word of warning from one Mr. Lupton, and despite having promised that he would never plunge, before the night was over, quote, stood to lose about £70,000 on the race, close quote. A sum close to £11 million today. Major Tifto stays completely silent and completely sober throughout the evening because, quote, the deed in which he himself was to be the chief actor was to be done very early in the following morning. And early the next morning, Tifto told his story sullenly, doggedly, but still in a perspicuous manner, close quote. Prime Minister had been lamed by a nail driven into the frog of his hoof. The racing world is abuzz. Quote, before the race was run, the causes of the accident were being discussed, and something like the truth was surmised in Cairo, Calcutta, Melbourne, and San Francisco. Close quote. But the debts had to be paid. The bets Silverbridge took on are known as anti-post and do not depend on the horse actually running. Unless the winners of the bets Silverbridge covered could be proven to have been involved in deliberately laming Prime Minister, they are legally entitled to their winnings. Silverbridge struggles to preserve his dignity and wants nothing more to do with any of it. His father's and his mother's fortunes provide him with the privilege to do this. £11 million. He attends the running of the race, congratulates the winner, and returns to London. There, after receiving a sympathy telegram from Mabel, Mrs. Montacute-Jones had her own telegraph wire at Killancodlem. He makes arrangements with his father's agent for the money he owes, and has this agent, Mr. Moreton, write to the Duke explaining the situation. At the Duke's request, Silverbridge then travels to Matching to join his sister, his father, and Mr. and Mrs. Finn. Poor Plantagenet, quote, £70,000 was a large sum of money to throw away among a nest of swindlers. But what consequences should he impose on his firstborn son? Quote, the Duke resolved that his only revenge should be to press on that marriage with Mabel Grex. Close quote. When he meets with his father, Silverbridge, sobbing and full of contrition, tells his father he will do anything to make amends. Anything, it seems, except marry Mabel Grex. The Duke makes it quite clear that part of the duty Silverbridge owes to his present and future titles is to marry appropriately. That is, to marry Mabel. To reach the last location, the Duke and Mary now travel 300 miles south from Matching Priory in Yorkshire to Custons, Lady Cantrip's country place in Dorsetshire, as per the arrangement made by the Duke and Lady Cantrip the previous July. Lord Popplecourt has been included in the party for the explicit purpose of marrying Mary, and he finds his task very heavy going. Quote, some vague, half-defined tale had been told him, not about Tregear, as Tregear's name had not been mentioned, but respecting some dream of a young man who had flitted across the girl's path during her lifetime, her mother's lifetime. Close quote. Oh my, poor Popplecourt brings Tregear's name up time after time, quite innocently ruining any chance he might have had at finding favor with either Mary or the Duke. So Tregear's absence from the gathering makes his presence felt almost more acutely than if he had been there in person. The same could be said of Glencora's absence. Whenever the Duke's distaste raises doubts about the matchmaking scheme, quote, he would endeavor to console himself by remembering the past success of a similar transaction in regard to his own wife. So he wreathed his face in smiles or made some attempt at it as he greeted the young man. Close quote. And Glencora makes another appearance in a short exchange between our old friends, Violet Effingham, now Lady Chiltern, and Alice Vavasor, now Mrs. Grey. Quote, he is hardly the sort of man, said Mrs. Grey, that I should have thought her mother's daughter would have chosen. Close quote. Perhaps Lord Popplecourt would have had more chance of success if he had been told the whole story, as Plantagenet was before he proposed to Glencora. Lord Popplecourt is not a complete fool. Quote, it was said of him that he knew on which side his bread was buttered, and that if you wish to take him in, you must get up early. Close quote. After that unpleasant dinner conversation with Mary, he puts two and two together and arrives at, quote, an uncomfortable belief that Tregear was the dream, and that the dream had not as yet been made to vanish. Close quote. Okay, got some questions. Number one, what is the impact of these very diverse settings? Number two, Frank makes only one actual appearance in these chapters, but I have so many questions about him. Why does he go uninvited to Grex? Is he taking revenge on Mabel for her rejection of him? How big a part does Lady Mary's money play in Frank's love? So, Frank. Number three, the ring. The ring was a gift from the old Duke of Omnium to his great-nephew and heir, Silverbridge. It is passed back and forth between Silverbridge and Mabel like a tennis ball. What significance does it have? So number three is, what about the ring? Number four, in our last session, Judy Goldenberg compared the competition between Isabel and Mabel to a horse race, with Silverbridge as the prize. We also have Frank and Popplecourt in a race, with Mary as the prize. What other situations in the novel are about gaming and gambling? There's lots of it. Number five, what is the significance of the horse's name? Prime Minister. Number six, I often encounter comparisons between Dickens and Trollope in which I hear some versions of Dickens wrote about the lower classes, but Trollope only wrote about the upper classes. I'm sure you can think of many examples of Trollope's characters from the lower ranks, but I think Major Tifto is probably the most tragic. My husband reminded me of that famous moment in the 1954 film On the Waterfront, when Terry Malloy, played by the iconic Marlon Brando, says, "You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody instead of a bum, which is what I am. I hope I have been effective in describing the glory and significance of owning a winner in the ledger. Horses are Tifto's world, and he drives a nail deep into the hoof of his contender for the ledger. What is it that motivates him to do that? Okay, thank you.